We've seen that the EU, for its convenience, tries to use general wording and general approaches without taking into account the specifics of each country. The number one issue for now is the war, and number two is, of course, the European integration, a historical process that will have consequences for decades, centuries, and not only for us, but also for future generations. And we explain to people how it affects everyone's life.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center and NGO Euro-Atlantic Course. And I'm your host, Myroslava Yaremkiv. European integration of Ukraine is not only the right of the country, but also a great responsibility of Ukrainian citizens, as well as the transparent and efficient work of all levels of government to achieve the high standards required by the EU. Communicating the progress and results of Ukraine's European integration is a vital aspect of implementing state policy. This approach will better inform citizens about how aligning Ukrainian laws with EU standards impacts their everyday lives. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the current state of Ukraine on its path to membership in the European Union, and how regions and communities can take advantage of the opportunities opened up by European integration. If you want to learn more about this subject, please continue watching this video and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss our videos in the future. The main goal of communicating European integration is to maintain support for Ukraine's accession to the European Union by Ukrainians and citizens of EU member states, as well as its gradual increase. It involves communication at different levels on the following issues. First, state policy in the field of European integration based on the implementation of the Association Agreement and other agreements between Ukraine and the EU. Second, key stages of integration, distribution of responsibility for the implementation of components of state policy. Third, the result and impact of EU integration on the life of every citizen. And fourth, monitoring and combating disinformation discrediting Ukraine's course for EU membership. The executive director of the Ukrainian Center for European Policy, Liubov Akulenko, will discuss the next steps for Ukraine in European integration and how to avoid repeating the mistakes of the Western Balkans in the process.
We have begun cooperating more deeply than the association agreement in several sectors. This is defense and security policy and telecommunications. When the association agreement was signed, there was not even a proper telecommunication app, and now we are moving towards roaming with them. What did we see that was part of the agreement, and I think will be here when we are not moving? We are not moving where complex systemic changes are needed. If they were needed in the association agreement, we'll certainly need them 10 times more in the negotiations. For example, what are the loose ends? What do we see in terms of systemic changes? For example, the establishment of the Intellectual Property High Court, the reform of customs authorities, trading in carbon dioxide emissions. Business is very concerned about it now. Implementation of safety standards in road transport. Given all these points, what else is in the store for us? First, there is a very problematic so-called cluster, which our government interprets as fundamental areas. They include all political reforms, anti-corruption, judicial, reform of democratic institutions, law enforcement, human rights, media, public procurement, and statistics. What's the problem with these areas? All the countries that joined did not have this requirement. Croatia somehow slipped through the cracks and had no requirement to implement these reforms for accession. Why didn't they? Because in these areas, there are no European objects of critical infrastructure, almost none. There is in the media sphere, there is in human rights. But there are no objects of critical infrastructure, no such list in judicial reform, anti-corruption reform, public administration reform. Why? Because those are political spheres that are formed historically, and we cannot take what is in Serbia or in France and say that it works for us. It won't work for us. What is the biggest problem with the Balkans now, and what can we repeat? We've seen that the EU, for its convenience, tries to use general wording and general approaches without taking into account the specifics of each country. In other clusters, we are giving a list of legislation, but we don't have it there. And what's the problem of the Western Balkans? The problem is that they are giving a very general wording for each of these political reforms to ensure. We have just considered and analyzed the judicial sphere. They have 4 blocks: independence, accountability, efficiency. For example, if you are giving a task, moreover, it is also divided into 3 groups of target indicators. They are called benchmarks, and we translate them as target indicators, introductors. We translate them as initial, intermediate, and final. All sections begin to open after the country shows these introductory indicators, the initial ones. These are the so-called reform plans. And then there are intermediate ones. This is how Ukraine formulates it in these reform plans. And then the final ones. We can stop moving if we don't make progress in the political cluster. What's the problem with the political cluster? Developing these reform plans is not a problem. We can develop them. But the question is whether this will be such general wording as the one in the Western Balkans. First of all, when you have a general wording, you don't know what you are doing. I like the candidate requirements because they were short and almost all of them were quite clear. But that was not the case here. And the country finds itself in a situation where you have to report something every year, and you are told every year that you have not fully ensured accountability, efficiency, etc. And for each reform, the country can be made to improve something for many years. Because what I understand, you understand in a completely different way. And this is the trap in which the Western Balkans is now. If nothing is changed for us, we will repeat it.
There are few opponents of European integration in Ukraine, and most of those who oppose it do not have enough quality information or are influenced by Russian propaganda. For the majority of Ukrainians, European integration manifests itself as a qualitative change in the state, a valuable mental transformation, convenient services, respect for the citizen, and conditions for decent life and work. Natalia Pakhaichuk, head of innovative projects of the National Network of Local Media Rayon in UA, will elaborate on effective strategies of communication with the public to raise awareness of people in the regions and increase support for European integration processes.
We have been covering the European integration issue since 2017 or so. We have discovered a lot of different new things for ourselves. And what may appeal to our fellow journalists is that this topic is very promising and very popular. The main thing is to be able to see it correctly, interpret and present it and offer it to your audience. Indeed, it was about the fact that for Ukrainians, European integration was closest in the form of the visa-free travel. Therefore, we started from that. Besides, our network was launched in the Volyn region, where visa-free travel was a very urgent, relevant issue that was practically implemented immediately. Now we work in 8 regions of Ukraine. There are more than 60 websites operating in our network. In addition to covering information about local life, we also try to convey some more important things as deeply as possible, further to each village where we work, where we cover the news. One of such processes which we constantly highlight is European integration. The number 1 issue for now is the war, and number 2 is, of course, the European integration. A historical process that will have consequences for decades, centuries, and not only for us, but also for future generations, and we explain to people how it affects everyone's life. And so our editorial office took up the coverage of this topic precisely in the manifestations of these changes at the household level. Certain lawmaking processes and tectonic changes ongoing at the state level are definitely reflected in the life of every community, even every family. Only we do not always know these relationships, what the cause was, what the effect was. My favorite example of how to explain European integration, how it will affect our lives or has already affected it, is connected with the changes in environmental legislation, namely a long, big process of creating nature conservation areas of absolutely different status. To explain where wildlife preserves, where nature reserves, and where national parks are created. This is an example when people living in such areas have to change their way of life because their lands or villages fall into the category of nature conservation areas, a way of life that has been established for centuries. Imagine people went to their river all their lives and fished, hunted, mowed grass, and grazed cattle there without control. And then suddenly they can no longer do any of this. You have no idea what riots we have had to cover. For example, what happened between the population and the administrations of the national parks. For example, Nobel in the Rivne region. Or what kind of misunderstanding faced the local population living along the Styr River in the south of the Volyn region, where a hydrological reserve was created. These are territories that are part of the Emerald Network, which require additional protection. We're obliged to create these conservation areas for a long time, and they are of great global importance. But people don't know about this. And a very big problem is that local communities do not explain to their population how this new status of territories can be used for their development. Of course, now these issues have naturally taken a back seat. Communities began to think less about their development and opportunities. After all, if someone has a free resource, manpower, they are trying to work to help and support the armed forces of Ukraine. And some things like entrepreneurial, recreational potential, development, tourism, etc., that our land is actually very rich in, take a back seat. But all this must be explained and talked about because there is no escaping from this.
You've been watching a special project by Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic course dedicated to the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukraine in Flames. In the description under this video, you can find information on how you can help Ukraine fight Russian aggression. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video. Slava Ukraini!